I've watched some of the sessions that you've been through, and they've been fantastic. Now we're going to jump into something a little bit different, which is going to be on negotiations. But before I dive into it, I just want to give you about a 30-second to 1-minute introduction on who I am and where I'm coming from, because I think it's sometimes useful to know who you're going to be dealing with for the next half hour or 40 minutes. As mentioned, my name is Deepak Malhotra. I'm at the Harvard Business School. I've been on the faculty there for about 15 years. I got there in 2002. And my area of work is negotiations. Negotiation, deal-making, disputes, conflict, diplomacy, anything in that area is things that I find interesting. Now, being at a business school, most of my work is in the world of business. And most of the stuff I do outside of Harvard Business School is working with companies, often early-stage companies or entrepreneurs, thinking about how to help them, consult with them, advise them on difficult deals, strategic partnerships, issues they face in scaling or other kinds of strategic problems. But while I work a lot with businesses, I also do some work in some other areas. I work with some governments thinking about how to help resolve armed conflicts, ethno-political conflicts. They're dealing with insurgencies or a peace process. I do some work with hospitals and doctors so they can think more carefully about how they might have effective conversations with their patients so that their patients can make better health decisions. And the reason I mention that, the work outside of the business area, in the world of conflict, in the world of medicine, et cetera, the reason I mention that is because it's gone a long way in shaping my own view about what negotiation is and what negotiation is not. And I like to lay out my perspective at the very beginning before I dive into specifics. Having negotiated and worked on negotiations and consulted with and studied negotiations in different industries, also in different domains like conflict and healthcare, one of the things I've come to appreciate is that at the end of the day, negotiation is not about dollars and cents. And it's not about deal terms. And it's not about emotions, and it's not about lives lost or lives saved. It's not about ceasefires. At the end of the day, negotiation, no matter where you're negotiating, what the substance of the negotiation is, how many people you're dealing with, negotiation is always fundamentally about human interaction. And the question we are always trying to answer, the problem we're always trying to solve as negotiators, is how do we engage with other people in such a way as to achieve better understandings and better agreements? That's it. Doesn't matter what we're negotiating, through which medium we're negotiating, what the stakes are, how complex it is. What we're always doing as negotiators is trying to figure out how do we engage with other people in such a way as to achieve better understandings and better agreements. And what I'm going to try to do over the next 30 minutes or 40 minutes is talk about some of the things that you might do, perhaps differently than you've been doing, to make it more likely that you achieve success in that endeavor as you're dealing with other human beings. Now, I spend all of my time thinking about negotiations. And I'm pretty sure you don't spend all of your days thinking about negotiations, but most of you would probably admit that many of the interactions you have in your work, but also outside of the professional sphere, have a negotiation element to them. Anytime you're dealing with someone who has a different perspective than you do, anytime you're dealing with someone who has different interests than you do, a negotiation lens can be useful. And so what we're going to be talking about now is some of the ways in which you can make sure that when you're negotiating, when you find yourself in a situation where you're doing a deal or you're in a dispute or some kind of conflict, you might be able to navigate it a little bit better. And the way we're going to do it is, what we call this session is negotiation tweaks. And the inspiration for that term comes from golf. I don't golf very much, but whenever I tell someone I like golfing and I would like to be better at golf, often what they will tell me is it's a really good idea to go to a coach, to a professional, to get at least one lesson. And I'll say, well, what's one lesson going to do? And they're going to say, well, it's not going to make you a great golfer. But immediately they're going to look at how you golf, and they're going to be able to give you a few tweaks. They'll see the way you grip the golf club. They'll look at your swing. They'll look at whether you're bending your arm or not. They'll look at how your feet are positioned. And they'll be able to pick up a couple of things that you can do that are quick fixes, easy tweaks that you can make that will have downstream consequences to make you more effective at golf. I haven't done that, but I like the idea. And so I'm going to do the same thing in this world of negotiation. In the 40 minutes I have, and now of course less than 40 minutes, I'm going to try to go through 22 things you might consider doing in your negotiations. Some of these things maybe you're already doing. Some of these things might be the opposite of what you've been doing. Some of these things might be something you never thought about before. And my hope is that everybody who's listening to this, either in the audience live here or online, we'll be able to find at least one or two or three things that you look at and you say, oh, that's interesting. I never quite thought of doing it that way. Or that's something I should really share with my team, because as an organization, we don't do that systematically enough. And the way we're going to go about it is the flow of the conversation is going to be, by and large, from what happens in the early stages of negotiation before you get into the room to what happens as you go through it and then when you leave the room. That's kind of how we're going to be thinking about this. And since I'm going to try to get through 22 of these things, some of these we're going to cover quickly. Others we're going to cover even more quickly. All right, so that's how this is going to go. So the first thing I want to point out, having advised on lots of deals, million-dollar deals, billion-dollar deals, multi-billion-dollar deals, and things where money is not at stake, one of the most important things I can tell you right off the bat is you want to have a strategy meeting. You do not want to walk in there relying only on your intuition, relying only on gut instinct. In my experience, intuition is very nice, gut instinct is very, very nice, but it is not strategy, nor should it be a substitute for careful analysis when the stakes are high or the situation is complex. Invite more people into that strategy meeting than you think you need. I have never regretted bringing in a couple of other folks. The fourth or fifth or sixth person will not add as much as a second or third person did, but they will shape the conversation in a way that will be useful. And they will add something that will be useful. They're going to see it from a perspective that's different from the ones you've been seeing it. The biz dev person brings something different than the general counsel, brings somebody different from the salesperson, brings something different from the operations person, and somebody who's on the front lines. You want to have a strategy meeting. Too many people walk into a negotiation thinking negotiation is about knowing what you want and then having 4 or 5 or 6 arguments for why they should give it to you. And they go into the room and they say, here's what I want and here's why it should happen this way, and then they hope for the best. That's not negotiation. As we're going to find out as we go forward, there's a lot more you need to be doing, and you need to be coordinated as a team. One other thing about being in a meeting like this. One of the mistakes I've seen people make, especially leaders of organizations or senior managers or team leaders, is that they create a culture, they create an environment in their meetings and in their organizations that rewards people for coming up with the right answer. Now that seems like a reasonable thing to do. You want the right answer, so you should reward people for coming up with the right answer or the right strategy. But I actually think that's the wrong way to go about it. You don't want people in the room to come up with or to feel like they're going to be rewarded for coming up with the right answer. You want to reward people for coming up with good arguments. Because this is not a math problem, usually. It's not like there is one right answer that the smartest person in the room is going to be able to figure out. If it's an interesting enough negotiation, if the stakes are high, if it's a complex negotiation, the solution is not going to be obvious to one person. It's going to be built on the good arguments that different people make. And it's not that you walk in and say, okay, whoever comes up with the right strategy is going to get a $1,000 bonus. But we do it implicitly. See, when the leader talks in a meeting, and you're sitting in a boardroom, you're sitting in any kind of meeting, whether he or she is the CEO or the founder or a team leader, when the leader talks, they look at everybody as they're talking. But when anybody else in the room talks, they're almost always looking right at the leader. And they're looking to see, is this person nodding along? Are they liking what I'm saying? And they try to get to the right answer as quickly as they can. That's not the kind of environment you want. You want to reward people for coming up with good arguments. Next. You have to know what's going to happen to you if there's no deal. This should be sort of obvious. You will make crucial mistakes if you haven't thought through carefully as a team, what is our walkaway point? How bad is it really if we don't get this deal? Or how good is it really if we don't get this deal? You need to know this, but there's a caveat. You don't want to become obsessed with what happens to you if there's no deal. One of the things that we've learned through research, through experience, is that it turns out negotiators who walk into a room obsessed with what's going to happen to me if there's no deal, those folks get systematically worse outcomes than people who walk into a room knowing what happens to them if there's no deal, but making the negotiation about what happens to the other side if there's no deal. When you frame the negotiation around what happens to them if there's no deal, now you're essentially making it about the value you bring to the table for the other side. And when you make the negotiation about the value you bring to the table, that's when you have the possibility, the opportunity to monetize the value you create in the system for the other side, for their organization, etc. So know what happens to you if there's no deal. Otherwise, you're going to make crucial mistakes. But as much as you need to know that, you need to focus on what happens to them if there's no deal. Why are they here today? What keeps this person up at night? What do I do for them that nobody else can do for them? If you frame it around that, you have a greater opportunity for creating and capturing value in that deal. Next, too many folks get obsessed with the substance of the deal for good reasons. Substance is all of the things that are going to be in the deal. The terms, the offers and counteroffers are about the substance of the deal. The language in the contract is the substance of the deal. What you don't want to lose sight of is process. Process is what gets us from where we are today to the finish line. And the finish line might be a signed deal. It might be the implementation of a deal, depending on the kind of negotiation you're doing. One of the things I advise all of my clients and all of my students to do is to get into the habit of negotiating process before substance. Here's what I mean by that. Imagine a scenario where you've been negotiating for, say, 6 months or 9 months or 10 months. And imagine that this is the kind of deal where that's a good amount of time. And after these 6 or 9 or 10 months, you finally get to the point where you think the finish line is in sight. You think this deal might be able to be done. Now, you've got a couple of concessions saved up in your back pocket for exactly a moment like today. And you throw those out there hoping it will seal the deal. And the other side looks at you and says, thank you, this is great, we really appreciate this, this is very helpful. Now, let me just go talk to my boss and see what she thinks about it. And you're sitting there going, wait, what? You have a boss? I thought this was it. I thought we were done. I've got nothing left to give. That's an example of what can go wrong when you don't negotiate process before you jump into negotiating substance. Negotiating process before you dive into substance is about asking things like, how long does it take an organization like yours to do a deal like this? Who are all the people that need to be signed on before this deal goes through? What are some factors that might speed things up, and what are some factors that might slow things down? Process before substance is also about having conversations like, what are we going to be discussing in the meeting tomorrow? Who's going to be in the room? What about these other issues that we care a lot about? When will we be able to touch on those? All of these things, none of these things have to do with the substance of the deal. It's all about how we're going to get from where we are today to where we want to go. And if you think about the negotiations that fail, many of them fail because people did not give enough attention, did not respect enough process. They didn't have a process strategy, they didn't coordinate on process, they didn't think through process. One other thing I'm going to talk about on process. It's going to be the next lesson. This is point number 5. It actually comes from the world of mediation. Any of you ever been through a mediation, like a conflict, a dispute mediation? Some of you clearly have. If you ever go through a really ugly conflict, it could be a business conflict, it could be a family conflict, any kind of conflict, and it's really ugly, and you go to a mediator whose job is to help you solve this problem. One of the things an effective mediator might do on day one, when he or she brings the people into the room, the mediator might say something like this: you two think you hate each other today? We're going to be at this for a week. And about 3 days into this process, you're going to hate each other more than you've ever hated each other. And when that happens, I just want you to remember something. That's normal. That's normal. Now think about why a mediator might say that. What happens if the mediator doesn't say that? And 3 days into the week, you hate each other more than you've ever hated each other. The emotions have gotten even stronger. There's more anger and anxiety than ever before. What are you going to think? You're going to think this is not working. All right, we're moving in the wrong direction. And you're going to quit the process entirely. And what the mediator is doing, it's called normalizing the process. The mediator is normalizing the process for you. They're letting you know that things don't go from bad to good, getting better every day when you try to take on these difficult challenges. The process from bad to good goes a little bit like this. And that's how you get there. So when you're down there, you don't overweight it too much. You don't read too much into it. This idea of normalizing the process is something we should be doing in negotiations of all kinds, not just ugly conflicts. I was talking to a guy from, he had a business in South Asia, and his business was, he had a lot of manufacturing facilities. One of the things he told me, we were talking about something else, he brought this issue up. He says, one of the things I've learned is I will not do business with anybody from the West, he said. And by the West, he meant the US, Europe, etc. He said, I will not do business with anybody from the West unless they are willing to fly into my city, get out of the airport, get into a car that we'll send for them, and drive from the airport to our manufacturing facilities, which are about 18 kilometers away and take about 3 hours to get to. Until they've done that once, they don't know how it works here. And the first time something goes wrong, they assume it's because we're stealing from them or because we don't know what we're doing. You need to normalize the process for them even when you're selling to them, but too often we don't do that. We're so busy trying to seal the deal, sign the deal, get them to say yes, that we make it sound like nothing will go wrong. There will be no disruptions. There will be no delays. We'll always be seeming as enthusiastic as we are today. And when any of those things change or go wrong, they end up overweighting it. But when you've let them know along the way, here's what's normal, here's how we get from here to there, we'll get there, but here's the path to it, it's less likely that delays, disruptions, and other sorts of bumps in the road end up being relationship killers down the line. Next, I know a lot of people who talk too much in negotiations. I know almost no one who asks too many questions. If you could have one mindset going into every future negotiation, people can have very different mindsets. Some people go in thinking this is war. Some people are thinking going this is relational. Some people are thinking long-term. Some people have a short-term attitude. Some people are thinking strategically. Some people are thinking tactically. You can have any mindset you want, really. But if you had to pick one, if you could take only one mindset and click it on before you walk into every future negotiation, I would strongly suggest walking into every future negotiation with a learning mindset. You are there above all to learn as much as you can about all of the parties that are relevant to this negotiation, whether they're inside the room or not. What are their interests? What do they care about more? What do they care about less? What keeps them up at night? Why are they doing this deal today rather than 6 months from now or a year ago? What are their constraints? What are the things they can and cannot do? How are they seeing the situations? Think about the questions you ask. Write down all of the things you wish you could know. They're not going to answer every question, but they're more likely to answer them if you ask than if you don't ask. And when you're done coming up with every question you can think of, I suggest you add another 10 more to the list. All right? And your team will help you. All right? A lot of people talk a lot, not enough people ask enough questions. Now, it's not just about asking more questions. You also have to ask the right questions. Now, every negotiation is different. And so the right question will vary depending on the context, the situation, where in the process you are. But one little hint, in general, why is more important than what? People talk about what all the time, what they want. You might say what you want. We want the deal done in 6 months. We want more money up front. We want exclusivity. We don't want exclusivity. That's the what. These are the demands people make, the positions they hold. Your job as a negotiator is to try and get underneath that and figure out why they want these things. What are the things that are driving them? What's the underlying motivation? And when you shift the conversation from what to why, you often find more ways of resolving the dispute, resolving the conflict, resolving the deadlock. Often, the two sides have seemingly incompatible positions. I want exclusivity, they don't want to give me exclusivity. Those seem incompatible. And if they're deal breakers for both sides, you're done. But sometimes what you find is when you start digging a little bit underneath the surface, why? What's their real fear? What are they concerned about? Is it that they never want to give it or they don't want to give it for more than a year? Is it the specific competitor they're worried about? What's the story here? When you go from what to why, often you find that seemingly incompatible positions actually are hiding underlying interests that are actually reconcilable. Get into the habit of asking more questions, get into the habit of asking why, and figuring out what's actually driving their demands. Next, they're going to be doing the same thing. They're going to be asking you questions, and sometimes these are not the questions you want to hear. How many of you know who Mike Tyson is? Okay. Boxer, heavyweight champion, known for a few other things. There's a story about Mike Tyson, and it may be apocryphal, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. When Mike Tyson had been heavyweight champion for some time, he was being interviewed, and somebody asked him, Mike, how do you sustain this level of success? The question is not how you got here, but how do you continue to stay here? And more specifically, every boxer that walks into the ring with you now, every one of them has studied you. They've seen all the footage. They've walked into the ring with a plan designed specifically to beat Mike Tyson. How then do you continue to win? And Mike Tyson says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Now, whether he actually said there's not, this is true. And the same is true when you're out pitching your wares, your product, your service, your solution, your idea, your approach. You need to think about all of the things that can go wrong and have answers for them or have a way of dealing with. In general, a little tip in sales. If there's a weakness in your argument, it's almost always better if it comes out of your mouth before it comes out of their mouth. If it comes out of their mouth first, it becomes a bigger thing. The fastest way to lose credibility as a salesperson is to walk in and make it sound like you think your product, your solution is right for everybody on the planet. Even if you believe that's true, the moment you sound like that, you lose credibility in their eyes because they don't believe it. They assume your competitors exist for some reason. They assume there are other interests and other ideas out there for some reason. And so what you need to be thinking about is if there's a weakness in the argument, if there's a counterpoint, if the competitors are actually telling them to ask these tough questions, how am I going to manage those? So have a learning mindset, but respect the fact that they see the world differently. Next. There is this notion that you should let the other side make the first offer. Now, I could have talked about this point for about 20, 30 minutes and get into all the evidence. All I want to suggest for right now is that I disagree wholeheartedly with this notion that you want the other side to make the opening offer. I am not saying that there are not occasions where that might be the right tactic. But I am a huge fan of being the party that presents the first offer, presents the first MOU, the first term sheet, the first LOI, whatever it may be, because it helps you control the frame of it. You set the reference point. You shape expectations. Think carefully about who's going to make the opening offer. There is tremendous power in the party that sets the opening offer, that creates the opening expectation. All right? So if you've heard this, and you may have heard it on TV, on some shows where they talk a lot about negotiations, I strongly suggest think about this a little bit more deeply. Next. One of the other things I'm a huge fan of telling my students, my clients, is never let your offer speak for itself. Whether you're making the opening offer or a counter offer, when you make an offer, don't let the number speak for itself. $50,000, $5 million, $100 million. Tell the story that goes with it. We are asking for X because ... We're asking for X. Here's our model. Here's our analysis. Here are our assumptions. The richer the narrative, the richer the story, again, the more likely your number sticks. More likely that the other side has to come up with a compelling reason before they choose to just ignore it. It is much easier to ignore an offer that does not come with a story, that does not come with a justification, that does not come with a narrative, than it is to ignore one that has all of those features to it. Next, label your concessions. The idea of telling the story that goes with it, if you sort of zoom out for a moment, what we're really trying to say here is don't leave it up to chance how they will interpret what you're saying. As a negotiator, you want to manage the attributions people make of what you're doing. So when you make a concession, for example, the exact same concession in a negotiation can seem like a nice gesture. It can seem like a wise approach to negotiation. But a concession can also seem like what? It could be a gift. What else? Weakness. You could look desperate. You could look naive. Well, what do you want them to think when you make a concession? Well, ideally, you want them to, ideally, you want them to think you are wise and nice, smart and nice, not naive or desperate. But the same concession can be interpreted in many different ways. So one of the things you always want to be doing, whether it's making a concession, whether it's calling them back, whether it's choosing not to call back, is think about the attributions they're going to make. And get into the habit of trying to manage the attributions. And how you do it depends on the situation. You're not going to say, here's a concession, and just so you know, that is because I'm wise and I'm smart and I'm being nice, not those things. But you need to think about, am I going to come across as desperate if I make it now or in this way without ... And how do I make sure that the right attribution gets established? All right. One of the mistakes people often make in negotiation is they get into what I would call mindless haggling. Now, there's going to be some haggling in a negotiation. They're going to start one place, you're going to start some other place. But the mistake we often make is to take a rich, complex negotiation and turn it into a series of haggles. We need to talk about price, we're going to haggle on price. And tomorrow we're going to talk about financing terms, we're going to haggle over financing terms. Then we're going to talk about exclusivity, then we're going to haggle over exclusivity. A better approach to negotiating, typically, is instead of going one issue at a time, is to negotiate multiple interests simultaneously. One of the pieces of advice we often give is try to break the habit of going one issue at a time and trying to get resolution on that issue and then moving on to the next thing. You're much more likely to find wise trades, where they're more flexible, where there's less flexibility, what you should be given, what you do not have to give if you are negotiating multiple issues simultaneously, rather than doing a series of haggle one issue at a time. Have comprehensive offers and counteroffers that you give. If somebody says to me, could you do like 60% up front instead of 40% up front? My answer is not yes or no. My answer is I have no idea what you're talking about. In what context? What are the other terms of this deal? And it's much more effective for both sides if you get into the habit of making package offers and counteroffers. But when it comes to making an offer, so next time you're in a negotiation, consider doing something a little bit differently than you might have done in the past. In your next negotiation, there will come a time when you have to make an offer. Either it's the opening offer or it's a counter offer. Next time you're supposed to make an offer, don't make an offer. Instead, make 2 or 3 offers at the same time. This is the notion of what's called making multiple offers simultaneously. Instead of saying, my offer is this price with this royalty rate with these terms, you give them 2 or 3 full packages. We can do it option A, we can do option B, or we can do option C. The reason to do that is because often you don't know where they have more or less flexibility. When you give them 2 or 3 different ways of doing it, you not only signal flexibility, which they appreciate, you can say legitimately to them, listen, we know what works for us, but we also want to make sure it works for you. So if you can do it with a very, very high royalty rate, here's what that would take. But if you don't have much flexibility on that, but you have flexibility on these other terms, we could do it this way or this way as well. My record, I believe, for the most number of offers I made at one time to the other side, it was a deal we were doing in Australia, was 27. Now it sounds crazier than it was. There was 3 broad categories of offers. We can do it this way, this way, or this way, with some permutations that were sort of described in each one. And the reason we had to do it was because they weren't willing to sit down with any of the people that were bidding for this project. And so we wanted to make sure that we're not guessing incorrectly what they care about more and what they care about less, where they do and don't have flexibility. So we're going to tell them all the different ways we can do it. Generally speaking, I am a huge fan of saying to the other side in a negotiation, I know where I need to get. I'm flexible on how we get there. I will often say exactly those words. I know where we need to get. I am flexible on how we get there. So as long as you can meet these needs, we're going to be flexible on style, structure, and anything else that you need. Or to put it a different way, the more currencies you allow someone to pay you in, the more likely you get paid. All right, so it's one thing to want this much, but if you're also going to tell them, and the only way we're going to accept it is if you do it this way, you're creating more constraints. If you show more flexibility in the deal structure, all of a sudden there's more degrees of freedom for them to be able to give you what you need to be able to say yes happily. Initial reactions matter. We know this in general. Let me give you one specific example of it, having been in the room and having been in a lot of negotiations where this often goes wrong. It's just a small tweak. Somebody makes you an offer on the phone or in a meeting, face-to-face, whatever. And it's a ridiculous offer. If it's a ridiculous offer, don't waste any time before you reject it or signal this to them. Sometimes you feel like, well, I don't have the authority to say yes or no, so I'm going to go back to my team and sort of discuss our response. It doesn't work so well if somebody says to you, so we're offering X. And you say, okay, well, let me write that down, I'll get back to you. And then you go back, and then you come back, and you say, it's totally ridiculous. It doesn't seem totally ridiculous, because if it was totally ridiculous, you probably would have signaled it before. Too often, we're not ready to respond to some things that may come up. It's not so different from being prepared to answer the toughest questions they may raise. Think in advance about what kind of signals you want to send them under different situations. Otherwise, the signal might not be credible. Next. Understand and respect their constraints. There are things in negotiations that you deserve, that are rightfully yours, that you, quote, should get, which you will not get simply because their hands are truly tied. And the sooner and the more effectively you figure out where they have more and less flexibility, where the hands are truly tied and where they might be able to give, the more likely you can navigate the deal in the direction that's going to get you what you want while allowing them to say yes. You need to put yourself in their shoes. You need to respect the fact that just because you want it and you think it's rightfully yours, it may be that there actually is some issue there where they have some hard constraints. Think about why they might reject your legitimate demands. Now, as you start giving them this benefit of the doubt, again, step back a little bit because there's a broader point I want to make. Very often people will come to me and they'll say something like, you know, I'm dealing with these folks and they're completely irrational. Or I'm dealing with these folks and they're very, very stubborn. Or I'm dealing with these folks, it's a very difficult negotiation because they're very untrustworthy. Never in my life has somebody come up to me and said, I'm in this really tough negotiation, I'm the irrational one. I'm the untrustworthy one, I'm the stubborn one. And I start to think that the nicest people on the planet must reach out to me for help because it's never them. What I want to suggest to you is that it doesn't do you any favors to see them as irrational. I got to tell you, and I've been in many parts of the world with many different kinds of negotiations and conflicts and disputes. The people you're dealing with are not irrational. it is highly unlikely that you're dealing with someone who's actually irrational. By irrational, I mean someone who is knowingly doing something that they know will reach the opposite of outcome of what they want. That's probably not what's happening. That would be irrational. I know A is going to cause B, I don't want B, and I'm still going to knowingly do A. That's not how people behave. Usually what looks like rationality to us is one of two things. It could be ignorance, or it could be that they have interests that we don't fully appreciate. So when somebody is saying no to what you know is the best offer they're ever going to get, and they're walking away when it's only going to be worse for them if they walk away than saying yes, that seems irrational, but maybe it's not irrationality, it's ignorance. Maybe they haven't fully understood the value to them. And if that's the problem, the solution might be how do we educate them about the value we bring to the table? Or it could be that they have different interests. Maybe accepting this offer makes them look bad. Even it's the best deal they're going to get, but saying yes maybe makes them look bad. And they don't want to look bad. That's not irrational. They just have other interests. Or it's the best deal they're going to find, but if they do it, it sets a bad precedent in future deals. There's something else going on. Before you jump to assuming somebody is irrational or crazy or evil or out to get you, step back and really try to understand how do they see the situation? What's actually driving this behavior? How does this person go to bed at night not thinking of themselves as irrational or crazy or evil? And when you have this level of empathy, you're not doing it to do them a favor. When you see the world this way, when you have this level of empathy, you're actually doing yourself a favor. Because if somebody is irrational, the only solution is to lock them up, all right? Or walk away. If they're evil, they must be destroyed. But if there's something else going on, it gives you more levers to push and pull to solve the issue, all right? Now, when it comes to this notion of economics and the psychology of the deal, it may be the best deal that they're ever going to get, but they're still saying no because one of the things that I've found in business deals and other deals is that often people can't say yes without looking bad. And there's a phrase that was coined initially by a fellow by the name of Bill Urey. He was a colleague of ours at Harvard Law School for many years. He came up with this phrase, which I love. He talked about it in the context of conflict. We need to get into the habit of writing their victory speech for them. We need to write their victory speech for them. We can't be so self-focused on what we need that we lose sight of the fact that they have an audience. And so one of the things you want to be doing in a deal, especially if it's a difficult negotiation, is think about the person who's on the other side of the table and ask yourself, how will this person possibly say yes to what I'm proposing and still be able to go back and declare victory to whoever their audience is? Maybe it's their boss, maybe it's their partners, maybe it's their team, maybe it's their shareholders, maybe it's their investors, maybe it's their voters, whoever it may be. How are they going to pitch this? How are they going to look good at the end of this deal? All right? Because what you don't want is to be generous, to bring a lot of value to the table, to negotiate in good faith, and still not get the deal, even though it was the right deal for everyone, because you didn't understand their real problem. In negotiations, you can't walk away saying, well, that's their problem. Anything that looks like their problem somehow finds a way of becoming your problem, all right? Because you're in a negotiation. Next, let's take this same principle and apply it in a more tactical way. Any of you ever been in a negotiation where somebody made an ultimatum to you? Threw out an ultimatum, like, we'll never do this. You must do this. Yes? Yes. If you've lived, you've had an ultimatum thrown at you. My response, if somebody makes an ultimatum to me, to our side, if I'm in a negotiation, if I'm in a conflict, if I'm in a deal scenario, if it's a diplomatic situation, whatever, if the other side makes an ultimatum to us, I don't care if it's face-to-face, if it's an email, if it's a phone call, my response almost always is the same. If you're going to make an ultimatum to me, my response is going to be to simply ignore it. I'm not going to ask you to repeat what you said. I'm not going to ask you to explain what you said. I'm going to pretend it was never said and move on and address everything else you've touched on except the ultimatum. Now, why is that? A week from now, a month from now, a year from now, there may come a time when what you said you would never do, you realize you must do. Or what you said you would never do, you realize is actually in your interest to do. And when that day comes, the last thing I want you to remember is having said, I will never do this. or the really last thing I want you to remember is me remembering you having said, you'll never do this. Because on that day, that will be the problem. It's the same principle. I'm thinking about how to write your victory speech for you on that day. I'm going to ignore your ultimatum so that I never force somebody to choose between doing what's smart and doing what makes them look good. To the extent possible, you want to align those two things. Now, you might ask legitimately, what if it's a real ultimatum and there you are ignoring it? Practically speaking, experientially, what I'll tell you is that's not a serious issue. And the reason is, if it's a real ultimatum, they really cannot do this. Don't worry. They're going to keep repeating that ultimatum over and over again through every channel, through the entirety of the negotiation. And at some point, you can decide, based on your understanding of the situation and where they've shown more and less flexibility and everything else you've learned in the process, that maybe this is a real red line for them. But it's also the case that often what comes across as an ultimatum isn't a real ultimatum. Sometimes people just feel like they've been pushed long enough, and they're trying to assert some control. Sometimes they're just trying to get some tactical advantage. I'll say I can never do it, and then they'll have to move. Sometimes, maybe cross-culturally especially, the language just gets used a little bit more strongly than it was intended or needed to be used. And for all those reasons, it's often better to just ignore it. Now, I will give you one variation on the theme. Sometimes, it is difficult to ignore what somebody said. If we're negotiating and the only thing you say to me is, I'm never going to do this, and that's all you said, and you're sitting right there, it's hard to ignore. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. If I must engage with what somebody said, and it's an ultimatum, what I will often do, this is the variation on the theme, I will reframe it as a non-ultimatum before I move on. So if you say to me, I can never do this, I might say something like, listen, I understand given where things are today, this would be very hard for you to do. I get that. And what I'm doing is creating at least two outs. First, given where we are today, in other words, tomorrow or a year from now, we may not be where we are today. And secondly, this would be very hard for you to do, and I get that, rather than this is, of course, never going to happen, all right? And never in my experience has somebody stopped me at that point and said, no, 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 that's not what I said. I said never, ever, ever, ever. Usually they'll let it go and they understand, okay, point has been made, and now both sides have some outs, all right? Now, that's the getting ultimatums. Let me also just say a quick word, point number 19, about making ultimatums. Because people often ask, should you make ultimatums in negotiations? I have sort of two criteria when it comes to making ultimatums. The we will never do this, sort of getting aggressive or absolutist, no flexibility on something. I will only make an ultimatum if A, it's a real ultimatum, in that I will actually follow through on what I said. Because for me, safeguarding our credibility and legitimacy is paramount. I'm only going to make an ultimatum if I will actually follow through on it if they don't do what was asked for. Second, even if it's a real ultimatum, even if I am ready to follow through on it, I will not use an ultimatum if I can find some other way of solving my problem. Because ultimatums can sometimes leave a bad taste in people's mouths. People don't like to be told what to do. They don't like it when they think you're being very aggressive or forcing them to do certain things. Some sort of psychological reactance comes in. So if I can find a better way of achieving what I'm trying to achieve, conveying what I'm trying to convey, getting the concession I need to get without getting aggressive tactically, I'm going to do it. But if both of these criteria are met, this is what I need to do, then I'm perfectly okay doing it. And often it's good that the other side knows what you can and cannot do. If this is truly a deal breaker for me, we're both better off if this is conveyed. Next point. One of the things that often happens is people walk out of negotiation and they didn't get a deal, which is okay. A lot of deals shouldn't happen. If there's a better partner they should be working with, if there's a better product for their problem, you shouldn't get the deal. No deal is not a problem. No deal is only tragic when you really were the right partner for them, when you actually did create value for each other, when there was nobody better for both of you than the two of you together. And when those deals end, and I know that's a little tragic because you've destroyed some value, the thing that I don't like is when somebody walks out of a room, and if I ask them, so what happened? They say, oh, we didn't get the deal. And I say, okay, well, what went wrong, or how come? And sometimes the answer is, I still have no idea. I still have no clue. I still don't know what they really wanted. That's the thing I don't like. I can live with the we didn't get the deal. But my view is, and it's not always possible to accomplish, but it often is, don't let negotiations end with a no. Negotiations should end either with a yes or with an explanation as to why not. If you're going to walk away and the deal is still a no, still push, still probe, still ask questions. Exactly what would have made it different. I've often said to the other side, I understand it's a no, I understand this deal is not going to happen, but paint me a picture. Imagine a world where you were actually saying yes, not no. Paint me a picture. What would that world need to have looked like? What would need to have been different about that? And people are often open to that conversation. And sometimes what I learn is I have even more confidence that this deal was never going to happen because what they would need is impossible for us to give at this point. Sometimes I say, wait a second, we can actually address that problem. And sometimes I say, okay, we can't get the deal today, but at least now I know what it's going to take in the future, either with them or with people like them, if we run into this kind of thing. All right? Next point. Small point, small tweak, small tactical thing, again, but something you see often happening. When you get done with the meeting, if it was face-to-face, phone call, whatever it was, I'm a huge fan of sending an email. Sending an email afterwards allows you to do a couple of things. First, it allows you to make sure you're still on the same page, that what you thought you agreed to actually has been agreed to. So you can sort of confirm where things are. Because the closest you'll ever be with that person of being on the same page is the moment you leave the room. And every moment after that, you're just drifting farther and farther apart regarding your recollections of what happened and what didn't happen. And those are being biased by what happened since then to each of you, and based on your own self-interest. So you can confirm, you can get some confirmation. And if they're going to say, no, that's not our understanding, better to know that now than later. It also allows you to sort of reframe the situation if you didn't frame it well in the room. Sometimes you walk out of a room and you say, man, I think we came across as too desperate. We didn't even mention that we're talking to these other people. Or we came across too aggressive. And it allows you to sort of reframe and use some more language around what your perception of the situation is. And the third benefit is you can get more information. Sometimes you walk out of a room saying, we forgot to ask them this. We don't even know who's supposed to be reaching out next. We don't know what the process is. So for all these reasons, small tweak, get into the habit of reaching out to people over email or some such thing after you're done with a negotiation to make sure you're on the same page, make sure you're framing the negotiation in the way that you want, and that you can get more information. Last point. I do not allow any of my clients to, in any negotiation that I've ever been, to lie. I'm a huge proponent of telling the truth always. 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 That is not the same as saying every time we walk into a room, we tell them everything we know. Say, this is the most we'll ever be able to pay, and here's the thing, and here's how much money is in my wallet. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about not lying. And the reason is, first, it's the right thing to do. It's not fair, I think, to say, well, we're negotiating, so that's different than how we are in real life. Or that was a deal. This is your real life. This is what you're doing. And incidentally, if you're sitting in this room or if you're on CNBC.com and you're watching this or wherever else you might be live streaming it, I don't know if Inc. is doing it as well, I'm pretty sure that there's nobody in this room or anybody who's watching this thing who can't afford to be more ethical. There are people out there who don't have very much. None of those people are in this room. So everybody here has the ability to just be more ethical when it comes to these things. And at least in my experience, people don't lie because they're slimy people. They often lie because they're not prepared. They're not prepared to answer the tough questions. Or they're impatient. They want to get somewhere sooner, whether that somewhere is success or there somewhere is farther in the deal process. I always have to remind people on our side, not because they're worse people than I am, I have the same temptations. You got to step back and you got to make sure you're being honest. And every great negotiator I've ever met, in business, in diplomacy, people that I really think of as effective negotiators, I think every one of them would tell you they guard their credibility with their life. If they say they're going to do something, they will, walk over coals to make sure they do it. And if this hasn't happened to you yet, I assure you, somewhere along the way in your journeys as deal makers, as negotiators, there will come a day when the only leverage you have in a negotiation is your credibility. It'll be the only reason somebody's willing to sit down with you. It will be the only reason they're willing to take the risk you're asking them to take. You have no other leverage except they think you're credible. They know you're honest. They know you're saying it and you mean it. They know they can respect or trust you. And when that day comes, you'll be even more glad that you didn't end up letting these things slide. Because most people, I don't want to get all preachy here, but since it's item number 22, why not? Most people don't lose their credibility by one, histrionic act of backstabbing that they did that everybody heard about. Usually people lose their credibility and they lose their reputation a little at a time. You said something you didn't end up doing it because it was inconvenient. You said earlier in the deal process, this is really important, you can't not have this, but later on you ended up making that concession. And now they're like, wait a second, how do we ever know what you mean? So you have to be very, very mindful of it, and I don't know where to draw the line except always, because anytime you draw the line anywhere else, then there's no accountability even to yourself. So that's 22 tweaks. I was told I had 40 minutes, and I hope that's actually true, because if it's true, then we're within time, and if that's not true, then we've taken somebody else's time. We're going to stop here. These are things that I'm not assuming. I'm assuming most of you are actually pretty good negotiators. I don't walk into a room like this thinking, here's people who don't know anything about negotiation. I actually assume the opposite. I assume most of you are very good negotiators. Some of you may be amazing negotiators. But I also think that every one of us could be even better. And so if we talk about 22 things and you find one thing that you find, oh, I never thought about doing it that way, or I should talk to my team about it, I think this will be time well spent. And I'm going to stick around after this session, and I'm going to stick around, I think you have a reception today at 5. I'm going to try to be there as well, and I'm happy to have any conversations you want about any of this. Good luck in your future negotiations. I hope you found something of value.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.